The clipboard was heavier than Sophie expected. Her fingers trembled on its edge, as if the paper inside could explode with some private truth the moment she glanced down. Antiseptic scent folded into the air like an unwelcome memory. The soft, forgettable music in the waiting room slowed to something like a clock measuring her pulse. She kept her breath small and steady, counting the heartbeat beneath her ribs, as if that rhythm alone might keep her from drowning in old promises. She had promised herself then, months ago, in the hollow aftermath of trust betrayed, that she would never let anyone close enough to break her again. Never love, she had thought, because loving felt the same as handing someone a map to the soft places and watching them cross every border. She had sealed that vow the way you press a paper flower into a book, careful, permanent, meant to stay untouched. The door opened. He stepped out of the exam room with a calm that seemed to arrive and measure with him. Daniel Hayes looked like someone the world expected to have answers. Glass rim of watch catching the fluorescent light, posture that never spoke of hurry, smile quick and courteous. He wore the uniform of confidence, a white coat pressed like a promise. But it was the softness behind his eyes that snagged Sophie's attention, the almost apologetic tilt to his mouth that made her throat tighten. He introduced himself, Dr. Daniel Hayes, and his voice was steady, the sort that didn't clatter around nerves, professional, polite. The clinical conversation started, and Sophie answered, each word pulled from a place that felt distant and glassy. Internally, she catalogued the antiseptic smell, the clipboard's edge biting into her palm, the way her knees felt like someone else's property. She kept her hands folded in her lap until he offered the form back, his fingers brushing the paper as though returning something fragile. For a second, against every rule she had written for herself, a small, ridiculous thought flared. What if trust could be rebuilt with gentle, unobtrusive gestures? What if softness could arrive without asking permission? The thought frightened her more than anything else. She left before the exam. The instinct to flee was not theatrical. It hadn't been a decision so much as an animal reaction. The room felt too intimate, the air too charged. She mumbled apologies, clutched her back to herself like a shield, and walked out into the corridor where the light was too bright and real. Outside, the city moved along without concern. Taxi horns, a woman laughing into her phone, a bus hissing by, and Sophie felt as if she had stepped from some other country, one in which her muscles relaxed enough to remember how to breathe. On the sidewalk, she pressed both palms to her face and let the heat come, letting tears blur the world so that walking would become simpler. She replayed the appointment in fragments. His calm voice, the glint of his watch, the small courtesy of his hand returning a paper. She scolded herself for noticing the way his shirt fit across his shoulder blades. She scolded herself again for the small, irrational hope that anyone could ever be safe to love. She had sworn it. Saying them had been the easiest thing in the world. Keeping them had felt, until now, like survival. If you love slow burn healings that make your chest flutter, tap like. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she found herself walking to a cafe 2 blocks over, the small one with mismatched chairs and a kettle that hissed like a creature constantly waking. She ordered tea like it might steady her, and sat at a table with a view of the street. People passed in warm halos of midday sun, whole lives moving in small, clean beats. Sophie tried to unspool the tightness in her chest into something less catastrophic, counting the number of coffee cups lined on the counter, watching a barista measure sugar with the precision of ritual. He was there, seated at a table by the window, his posture relaxed, hands folded around a warm mug. Sophie almost stood, because it felt less like coincidence and more like physics, as if proximity followed a pull they hadn't invited. He looked up at the bell on the cafe door with a polite glance, and their eyes met, and the world rewound and started again with a quieter urgency. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, as if it hadn't been the extraordinary thing it was. She had nothing witty. She offered the sort of small, embarrassed smile that belonged to people used to deflection. "I come here a lot," she said. The words felt defensively plain. "Me too," he said. "It's a good place to think, or to hide." They spoke as if they were two strangers in a city that liked to misplace people. His manner was warm but measured, a gentle humor that didn't pry. He made no assumptions, asked no questions he had no right to ask. Sophie found that talking to him was like walking on a ridge. She kept waiting for the ground to give. He mentioned his work with an ease that made it sound like an afterthought. "I run a clinic on the west side," he said, "mostly outpatient, a tiny part of a much larger thing." He didn't catalog his successes, didn't flaunt his stability. He spoke of patients as if they were people who had lived and not as objects of some noble effort. There was an honesty to how he listened. He folded attention around her sentences like a towel, making what she said feel important without pinning it. When she stumbled over a detail or diverted, he met the gap with patience rather than prodding. It occurred to her, between the clink of spoons and the murmur of other patrons, that he was not what she had conjured when she promised never to love. He wasn't the kind of figure she had imagined popping up across the years of her vows. He was ordinary in small, grounding ways. too ordinary to be the villain she had feared, and that ordinary aspect both threatened and soothed. Days passed. She told herself it would fade. She told herself that a doctor had been a doctor, a courteous man, nothing more. Then she found his face in the back pocket of her phone. The night after the cafe, she sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop, the glow from the screen making the kettle look high and blue. There was nothing dramatic about the way she typed his name. Clean letters, a click that echoed off the draining sink. The search results were a tidy, effortless row of headlines. Philanthropic gala, breakthrough clinic model, a profile photo captured with perfect lighting that made his jaw look like a careful sculpture. There were articles about a medical startup he'd helped build into something that serviced clinics, about collaborations with tech companies. His name appeared on a board of trustees. His face smiled from magazine spreads praising leadership in medical entrepreneurship. Sophie's stomach dropped. It wasn't the money that pinched first. It was the tilt of her own assumptions. Money was neutral until she made it painful. She remembered the promise she had sealed months ago, how fiercely she had folded herself into a cocoon of limitations to avoid being hurt again. Seeing his accomplishments felt like stepping into a room with glass floors. Suddenly, everything she had promised herself to avoid was above her, a wall she couldn't climb. What if this was the kind of life that belonged to people who didn't know how to be ordinary? What if being with someone like him would make her an accessory to something she didn't want to be? She imagined their conversations reframed under chandeliers she didn't have the vocabulary for, imagined misunderstandings growing stems from assumptions. Her mind threaded through a gallery of worse possibilities until she was breathless. She started to withdraw. Texts went unanswered for hours and then days. When her phone buzzed and his name lit the screen, she felt the old betrayal like a fresh salt wound. She deleted messages she had written and then edited, each reworded line a step toward safety. She told herself she was protecting the fragile map of her life, preserving the places she had patched alone. The truth was simpler and meaner. She was afraid of being insufficient, afraid that if she let him closer, the gap between their worlds would be revealed, and she would not measure up. He noticed. He did not respond with theatrical gestures. He did not show up with flowers or grand proclamations. He sent notes that read like bookmarks, short, unobtrusive, gentle. A message asking if her favorite tea had arrived at the cafe. A picture of a book he thought she'd enjoy, left at the bookstore with her name in the order notes. Each small act was an unobtrusive arrow, not aimed to wound but to mark him as present. There is a subtle cruelty in being pursued with restraint. You see only the outline of someone trying to reach you without imposing. It forces you to choose. Sophie told herself that choosing meant submission. She told herself that resisting was the only way to stay honest. Yet the small cracks began to show. A laugh slipped out when she discovered the book he'd recommended waiting for her behind the counter at the shop where she worked. Her coworker teased her, and she blushed and muttered something about being predictable. It wasn't instant thawing. Her walls stayed stubbornly high. But a particular afternoon in the bookshop shifted something small and irrevocably. Daniel came in under the pretense of browsing. The bell above the door gave an unassuming jingle, and he was there, leaning over a table of new arrivals with the same composed expression. For a long moment, he simply watched her, as if to confirm that she was real. "Busy?" he asked. "Always," she said, her voice scraped between the shelves. He didn't comment on the hours or the late deliveries or the customers who left coffee rings on the reading chairs. He complimented a display she had made, an offhand praise, and his words landed like a salve. "You've got a good eye," he said. "The way you've arranged these, it's like the store is telling a story." "That's the point," she replied, surprised at how easily she had given him that reply. He stayed a little while, asked about an obscure title she recommended, then left with a receipt folded neatly into his wallet. That evening, she found a small slip tucked behind the register, a note in his handwriting, short, unobtrusive, thanking her for the recommendation. She read the line and felt something unclench. He was not loud in his affections. He was present in ways that didn't demand her surrender. He sat 2 tables over at the cafe. He leafed through a book she had loved. He left messages that smelled of quiet attentiveness. His persistence was like water wearing at rock. Patient, patient. Once, when the rain had pulled streaks down the shop's windows, he asked a question she hadn't expected. "Do you ever worry that you're not enough?" His voice was precisely measured, a place held for something honest. Her laugh sounded brittle. "All the time," she admitted. The words tumbled out not as confession, but as a fact. The shop was empty enough for secrets. "My last relationship, It taught me I could get lost. I promised myself I wouldn't do that again." He considered this, the rain tapping a soft percussion in the background. "Promises are important," he said. "But sometimes they're a way to prevent possibility. Not all vows are protection." Sophie thought about that as the bell jangled and someone came in brushing rain from their shoulders. He had the kind of attention that didn't pressure.
He had his own shadows, she could tell. Not the kind you could sweep away with generosity or time, but etched lines around his expression when he thought no one watched. She imagined a ledger of disappointments tucked under his coat, quietly tallying. She, unlike him, kept her ledger in plain view, the promise sworn like a sign hanging from the door. Weeks folded into a pattern. He appeared at the edges of her life in respectful ways. A coffee on her desk with a typed note that simply said, "For you, no expectations." A message about a local author event he thought she'd be interested in. Both were so small and unobtrusive he might have been doing the same for anyone, yet they accumulated into a weight that felt both terrifying and warming. It was during one of those ordinary evenings, returning from an extra shift, that she finally let a part of herself hope. The sun was low and honeyed, and the city smelled like hot pavement and pretzels. She stepped into the subway, clutching a stack of returned books against her chest. Her bag, heavy with the day's receipts, thumped against her thigh. A sudden lurch of the train and the world tilted. She felt a weakness at the base of her skull like someone had unscrewed the knob to hold on. The lights warped into blurs. A cold wave slid under her collarbone. She leaned a hand against the metal pole and tasted iron on her tongue. The carriage swam. "Are you all right?" a voice asked. It was urgent but gentle. She blinked and met Daniel's eyes above the crowd, the concern there uncloaked, visible, real. He was standing close enough that she could smell the faint citrus of his cologne, but he didn't crowd her. He reached for her arm, steadying without clutching, and offered her an open bottle of water like a fact. "I think I'm faint," she managed. Her voice felt far away. "Stay with me," he said simply. She tried to will herself steady. Her head buzzed with too much and nothing at once. The carriage felt hot, compressed, like an overstuffed suitcase closing in on her ribs. Faces around them blurred. Someone pressed the emergency stop. Daniel's hand at the small of her back felt like an anchor, and not like the repositioning of a lover. There was an odd clarity. He was exactly the kind of person who would stay in the middle of things to keep others safe. The paramedics on duty at the station were practiced and precise. They helped her off the train, checked her vitals with smiles that aimed to reassure but didn't overpromise. Daniel walked beside them to the concourse, sitting with her on a bench while they assessed. "You should get some fluids and a glucose check," one of the paramedics suggested, and Daniel's hand moved so briefly to the back of her neck, an instinctual human gesture, and then he stepped away as the medic took over. She watched him the way someone watches the tide, measuring small, steady patterns. His expression held worry, and something like regret.
He did not try to steer the scene, did not override professionals. He answered the paramedics with a competence that fit him, then retreated to the periphery when it was necessary. When the ambulance pulled up, they helped him stand aside so the EMTs could work. His presence softened the space, like a promise of company, without pressure. Sophie sat on the hospital bed with an IV drip correcting a dehydration she hadn't realized she had allowed herself to accumulate. The fluorescent light hummed. The beep of the monitor became a companion, pulsing in time with her slowed breath. A nurse explained the routine, the likely causes. It was plausible. She had missed meals and late shifts, drank too little, let worry knot her stomach until it unraveled in the wrong place. She didn't like being fragile, though in that white room, fragility felt less like a failing and more like a shared fact. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching as someone might watch a delicate vase on a windowsill, careful, reverent, wanting to reach but mindful of caution. He said nothing for a long time, as if his voice was a thing he had to shape before releasing. "I shouldn't have left without finishing," she said privately, more to herself than to him. "I don't know why my body does this." "Don't blame yourself," he replied. The line was small but sincere. He had an ease in the way he spoke to professionals, an acceptance that this was the domain of others now, and an awkward human charm in how he regarded her privately. "You were doing too much. You need to let people help." She wanted to tell him that helping felt like an invasion, that accepting help meant handing over some part of her map to a stranger, that she still measured herself against the person who had betrayed her. But the hospital light made confessions feel exposed, and she wasn't ready to peel that skin back. As the nurse adjusted the line and the room settled into a quiet that announced the city's hum beyond the glass, Daniel took his watch off and rubbed at the strap as if it had a mind of its own. She noticed it then, the way the light stung off the metal, the watch glinting in a small, private way. It could have been an ornament of status if he wanted it to be. He didn't wear his wealth like armor. He wore it like a tool, useful and unflashy. "I shouldn't have scared you on the train," he said, then quickly added, I'm glad I was there." She wanted to be annoyed, to accuse him of invading, of showing up in ways that made her vows feel ridiculous. Instead, something like gratitude unwound inside her. "Thank you," she said, the words simple and small. He nodded, and for a moment their eyes stayed locked like two pieces testing a fit. There was something exposed in his gaze then, an old hurt, a careful keep. Sophie saw it and recognized it because it mirrored the architecture of her own heart, places that had been shut tight because they had been broken before.
"People have a way of walking away," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It makes you careful. It makes you build walls." Sophie thought of the promises she had set like stones around her life. She thought of how heavy they had felt, and how sometimes the only way they would move at all was with a force that didn't shame them. "I built one," she confessed. Her voice barely rose above the beep of the monitor. "I told myself I would never." She stopped, the rest of the sentence hanging like a live wire. "Love again," he finished. The words weren't a triumph or an accusation. They were an offering, picked clean of any expectation. For the first time since the clinic, he allowed himself a softness that didn't feel like giving in. She looked at him then, truly looked. And in the steady, even light of the hospital room, his expression cracked open to reveal something tender and startlingly human. "I said it because I was terrified," she admitted. "Because love had been... it hurt in a way that made me feel worthless. I thought the only way to be safe was to be nothing to anyone." He didn't straighten or brush it off. He didn't say anything profound. Instead, he simply sat down in the chair near the bed, and the small motion rearranged the space into one where conversation could breathe. He kept his hands folded in his lap, an act of containment, and she recognized in it a mirror to her own attempts at containment. "I know what that feels like," he said after a moment. His voice had an edge now, a memory of something that could have hardened him but hadn't entirely. "I thought I had my life arranged so it was safe. Then something happened and the plan..." He paused, the thin line in his mouth betraying a story he wasn't ready to tell. "Plans break," he finished simply. "Was that your ex?" Sophie asked before she could stop herself. The word carried more accusation than she intended. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I learned a hard lesson about trust." His glance slid away, like someone averting a bruise. "It made a lot of things harder." There was no pity in his confession, no dramatic outpouring. It was not given to solicit sympathy. It was offered like a fact. Sophie felt a strange relief that he too carried the kind of scar she did, a private, quiet wound that didn't demand immediate repair. The nurse checked a chart at the foot of the bed, and then smiled, a practiced, efficient warmth. "You'll rest here for a bit," she said. "We want to ensure you're stable, hydrate you, and then you can decide whether to go home." The idea of going home was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. Home meant the city in her small apartment, where she had learned to reconfigure her life around guardrails. It meant the old safety of solitude. To go back would be to close the door on this strange figured presence with the ambiguous watch and the calm voice. He stood to leave before the nurse finished the sentence. "I'll wait outside."
"If you need anything." He didn't finish with the typical offer of contact. He sat with the boundary of the hospital rules and kept it respectful. Sophie watched him walk to the hallway, his coat collar catching the light as he passed under the fluorescent tubes.
He paused at the doorway and turned back, looking at her the way someone looks at a very small, delicate piece of pottery they mean to keep safe. "Call me if you need," he added. And this time there was no professional posture in the offer. It was personal, modest, and entirely voluntary. She watched him go and felt the familiar tug of fear, this time not only for the possible hurt, but for what this attention might make her risk. The promise she had carved into memory shook, a small fissure running across its surface. Outside the room, the hallway hummed with the hospital's low activity. A cart wheeling by, a distant conversation clipped and clinical, heels clicking against tile. Sophie's mind spun through scenarios and equations. Being with someone like him carried complications, layers of social difference she had rehearsed defenses against. But still, beneath the practical considerations, another truth gathered like a whisper. That night she lay awake back in her apartment with the city's light filtering through the curtains. Her phone vibrated with a name she had grown oddly fond of seeing, Daniel Hayes. The message was short, harmless. "Hope you sleep well. Take care." She put the phone face down and told herself she was safe inside the promise she had made. Yet in the dark she saw his profile as she had seen it at the clinic, as she had seen it at the bookshop, and the idea of safety felt suddenly porous, like fabric threadbare in a place she hadn't noticed. The next morning she went back to work, daylight pressing over the city as if the day could erase the delicate precariousness between them. Her coworkers chattered about the usual things, shipping delays, latte art competitions, but Sophie moved through the shop with a new awareness. The stack of returned books, the dust motes in the sun, the precise way the bell over the door chimed, all of it took on the status of a ritual. Then, mid-afternoon, when the sun had slid toward the west and the shop smelled of paper and lemon cleaner, she felt it again, a thinning at the base of her spine, an overwhelming lightheadedness that made speech a separate, distant act. Her hands went damp. She reached for the counter to steady herself and the world spun into an odd watercolor blur. She had been pushing, she realized, the paperbacks, the late hours, the half-eaten lunches, the constant low-level anxiety of being watched by bills and obligations. It had been cumulative. She had been brave in the small, exhausting way of those who had learned to survive without asking for rescue. The first sound she heard was the bell on the door, tinny and sudden. Then footsteps closer, and a voice she knew with an intimacy that surprised her. "Sophie?" She looked up. Daniel was standing at the threshold, soaked from a sudden rainstorm that had arrived over the city. He hadn't come to the shop to press matters. Instead, he had ducked in to escape the weather. He did not hesitate. His gaze went to her, taking everything in with quick efficiency. "Are you all right?" he asked. The nearest customer froze, as if expecting some sort of spectacle. Her vision tunneled. She felt the world narrow to the size of her pulse. "I don't—" Her voice failed. He moved toward her, and she braced for the old reflex of pulling away, for the fight-flight that had been her default for so long. But the motion that followed was simple and humane. He reached for her arm to steady her, and then, without continuing to hold, stepped aside to give her space as she found her balance. His presence was the kind that meant to help, but not to possess. She felt everything dim. The last thing she registered before the edges of consciousness softened was the blur of his face leaning toward her, the way his mouth moved and a word she couldn't hear. Then the shop sounded far away. The smell of lemon cleaning fluid became a distant note, and the world folded. When Sophie came back, it wasn't to the cozy bed in her apartment, not to the book-lined walls she knew like an old friend. It was to a white ceiling stitched with fluorescent lines, and to the steady, unfamiliar beeps of a monitor. The air smelled sterile and bright. Her throat was raw, and the movement of her limbs felt like returning to the surface after being submerged too long. She turned her head and saw him. Daniel sat a short distance away, hands clasped, an expression on his face that made the small hairs at the nape of her neck stand up. He had not been there when she blacked out. She didn't remember, but his presence now was impossible to misread. There was worry, yes, but beneath it lay a softness that made her chest ache. He rose when she saw her eyes open and stepped forward, but not too close. The nurse smiled and walked to the end of the bed, saying something about routine checks and, "We caught it in time." Her voice was efficient and kind, laying out the practicalities like paving stones. Daniel answered succinctly when asked, an account of where they'd found her, details he had provided at the station. He was careful, as if aware of the shadow lines of authority that separated him from the role he wore in hospitals. Sophie wanted to say something, about the vow, about the way the presence of his hand steadied her as the train lurched, about the chain of small mercies that had kept her anchored. Her tongue felt thick. Instead, she whispered, the confession spilling out soft and fragile. I promised I wouldn't love again. The words landed between them, small and dangerous. She watched him as if watching the weather change, searching his face for an answer she couldn't name.
His expression shifted in the most honest human way. Surprise, then a softness that matched hers, and then, unexpectedly, a tiny disbelieving smile. You said that? He asked, voice low. Yes, she said. I said it to survive. He sat back down and let out a breath that sounded like relief and something else, something like shame. I thought I had closed the door too, he said quietly. It seems both of us have been trying to keep our worlds to ourselves. She felt something loosening, not because the vow was broken out of carelessness, but because the honesty between them had opened a crack. It was terrifying and necessary. Outside, the hospital corridor hummed with life. Nurses spoke softly. A tray clinked. For a moment, the room became a stage for small, careful truths. She didn't know how to proceed. The pledge she'd made to protect her heart still felt real, a structural part of who she had been since betrayal. But lying in a hospital bed with Daniel Hayes watching her with a worry that was not intrusive but true, her promise seemed less like a fortress and more like a wall someone had begun to chip away at. She reached for his hand, not because she needed saving, but because human warmth felt like a permission she hadn't given herself in a long time. Daniel's fingers closed around hers, a gentle clasp that asked nothing and offered a quiet steadiness in return. Then the door opened and the nurse stepped aside with a clipboard full of instructions. The moment needed more than the private exchange could offer. There was the practical conversation about tests and follow-ups, the names of specialists, and a suggestion to slow down on hours. The professional part of the evening arrived like an obligatory curtain. Still, as the nurse spoke and the lights hummed, in the space between medical routine and human confession, Sophie felt the promise she had made vibrate. It had been a vow born of fear, not truth. She had sworn never to love again as armor. Lying here now, with a small warm hand in hers, and the steady presence of someone whose life occupies spaces she couldn't yet name, the armor felt heavy and unnecessary. She thought of the cafe where she had first seen him outside the clinic, of the soft kettle hissing, of the watch glinting in the sun. She thought of how many small things had accumulated into a presence she hadn't invited, and yet now couldn't imagine was wholly unwelcome. Outside in the corridor, footsteps approached, polite, purposeful, and the world began to shift toward the planning that would decide where Sophie went next. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and let herself feel the fragility of the moment. Promises, fears, the tender presentation of two people, raw and trying. Something small and inevitable was unspooling between them, and both of them, in their quietly guarded ways, had noticed. The map of their lives would have to be redrawn to make space for that possibility.
For now, the room hummed with machines, and the night pressed its hand against the window. There was more to come, quiet confessions, choices neither of them could yet foresee, but in the thin electric pause that followed her fainting, an unspoken truth settled like a soft dust. Vows could be re-examined if two people were willing to be gentle enough to listen. If Sophie couldn't yet step across the threshold of trust, she could at least see it across the room, framed and possible. When she finally drifted into a doze, Daniel stayed in the chair nearby, a watch glinting in the dim light, and his hands folded as if in thought. He had not come to claim anything. He had come simply to be present. It was the kind of care that might, in time, ask her to consider that promises made in fear could be rewritten in deliberate tenderness. Outside, the city breathed on. Inside, the monitor ticked in soft metronome. Everything, fragile and real, waited for the morning. If someone had told Sophie when she first left the clinic that this was the way things would begin, gentle, careful, threaded with fear, she might have laughed. Now, lying quiet and slightly afraid, she felt the hum of possibility like a slow-starting engine. If this story is moving you, subscribe for more heart-stirring tales. The morning light came thin through the hospital blinds,
drawing pale lines across the floor. Sophie woke to the quiet of machines and the soft susurrus of distant footsteps. For a breath, she forgot where she was, then remembered the bookshop, the kettle, the rush of the train, and the way her limbs had gone suddenly, terrifyingly light. She turned her head and saw Daniel still in the chair, the curve of his silhouette softened by sleep. His jaw had a shadow she hadn't noticed before. His watch lay on the bedside table like a small, patient thing. He blinked awake when she caught her watching and smiled the kind of smile that was careful not to take too much space. "How are you feeling?" he asked, voice husky with the sleep he'd let himself have sitting upright. "Like I borrowed someone else's body for a time," she said, and the edges of a tiny laugh escaped her. She tugged the blanket higher, embarrassed by how exposed she felt when someone else had seen a private collapse. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands folded. "You're stronger than you think," he said, and the sentence landed oddly. Not a balm, not a boast, just a truth, offered without demand. They talked about small things first, the nurse's efficient instructions, the taste of the IV, the likely cause being exhaustion and missed meals. The practical conversation was an anchor. It kept the confessional part from arriving too quickly. But when at last the talk shifted, it did so quietly, as if someone had opened a small window and let a current in. "Do you ever feel like you have to be worth something to be loved?"
Sophie asked, because if she didn't say it out loud, it would keep setting like concrete inside her. The question was part confession, part test. Daniel's fingers absently smoothed the crease in his pants. "More than I would admit," he said. His voice came out softer than she expected. "I spent a long time measuring myself against a standard I didn't choose. It made me legalistic about warmth, about who deserved it." "What happened?" Sophie asked, because curiosity edged everything between them now, and because asking made the thing less mysterious, and therefore less threatening. He swallowed and looked at the window for a moment, eyes narrowing as if the memory had a shape. "My last relationship, both in the personal and professional sense, ended with a fracture. I trusted someone with the things I cared about, and they turned them into a spectacle. I lost not just the person, but the sense that the world was a safe place. After that, I made plans, and I kept them. Plans are easier than people. They don't surprise you." Sophie registered the economy of his explanation. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a statement of the slow, steady pain that had taught a man to build walls. "Did you think you could close the door entirely?" she asked, because she saw what that kind of armor did to the inside of someone. It made rooms dim and lonely. "I thought I could." He let out a breath that sounded like a tiny apology to himself. "For a while, I believed I was better off without goodbye on the table. But life tends to be wilder than our plans." His honesty had the effect of softening something rigid inside her. She could see the ledger of his life, carefully kept, resigned entries, and she thought, not for the first time, that the gleam of his watch was less about show and more a quiet punctuation to a life kept in order. She remembered the vow again, the one she'd pressed into herself like a rule. "I told myself I would never let anybody close enough to hurt me like that again," she confessed. The words were less dramatic in daylight and less weighted by the hospital's small ironies, that she had collapsed in a shop she loved, and that the person who'd stayed had been the man whose mere presence had made her heart behave traitorously. Daniel's hand found hers across the thin blanket. He didn't move with possessiveness. He touched with the gentleness of someone who knew contact could be misread. "Thank you for telling me," he said, simply. "It matters that you said it." She looked at him then, at the soft lines gathering at his eyes. There was a tiny surprise in his face, an expression Sophie had not expected to see when she had first fled the clinic. "I thought I couldn't," she began, then stopped, the sentence curdling into uncertainty. How could she say what she felt without making it an accusation or an expectation? "Could what?" Daniel asked, his tone an invitation rather than a prompt.
"Love," she whispered, and the word came out fragile and ridiculous and terribly true. "I told myself I would never love again. I thought if I held that promise, I could make sure no one would take me apart." There, in the sterile light, among the beeps and the ordered efficiency of the nurses, she did the thing she'd sworn never to. She opened a part of herself that feared being found wanting. Her voice trembled. "But being with you, your patience, the way you listen, it's not the same as the hurt I know. It's different. I don't want to build a life of fences anymore."
Daniel's face changed as if someone had shifted a lens. He looked startled in a way that made Sophie's throat ache. A raw, beautiful kind of shock that came when the thing you had convinced yourself would never happen began, silently, to occur. He began, then stopped. The word hung between them like a small animal waiting for permission to make itself known. "I thought I would never," she said again, but this time she finished the sentence. I promised myself I would never fall in love again. I said it to survive. But now," she stopped, because sound made things real in a way the mind couldn't always process. She met his eyes and added, "I didn't know how to keep loving alone. I don't want to anymore." Her breath hitched. "I love you." The confession was utter and plain and so small that it might have been missed if anyone else had been in the room. But Daniel heard it like a bell. For a beat, he looked as if someone had asked him to reckon with a calculation he had never been asked to make. He laughed, a brief, incredulous sound, and then shook his head. "You love me," he echoed, as if proving the words true by saying them aloud. "I do," she said, and the certainty in her voice surprised her more than anything. It didn't feel like a cliff jump. It felt like the deliberate step of someone who had finally found the courage to stop running. Daniel's eyes flashed with something complicated, joy braided with fear and an almost palpable disbelief. He stopped. There was a tremor at the edge of his composure that made him human in a way she had not expected from a man who managed a clinic and a board and public praise. "I convinced myself I couldn't ever give that back," he said, then looked away, shame and something like regret crossing his face. "I thought my heart was a ledger full of debts, and I was too afraid to bring anyone into the accounting." Sophie felt the weight of those words. He had been wounded, yes, but he was also honest in a way that demonstrated the very capacity for tenderness he claimed to lack. "Do you think you can?" she asked, because she needed to know whether his vulnerability contained the willingness to try. He met her gaze and let out a slow breath. "I don't know the answer yet," he admitted. "But right now, I want to learn how to be present. I want to learn how to make room for something that isn't part of a plan."
"I want to try, if you'll have me." They sat in a silence that wasn't empty, but full of the careful settling that happens when two people rearrange the furniture of their lives. When the nurse came to check routines and discharge instructions, the professional rhythm stepped in with civility, creating space for boundaries. Daniel listened to the nurse when she asked about allergies and aftercare. He answered with the calm competence of someone who could speak without turning the room into an invasion of intimacy. It was important, Sophie realized, that he had not tried to take charge of the medical parts. He had been present without assuming authority. "I'll walk you to the exit," he said, as they left the hospital later that day, and the sentence felt like surrender and offering combined. Outside, the city's ordinary clamor returned, the jackhammers, the vendors, the uneven rhythm of commuter feet, and Sophie felt oddly steadier on her feet. They agreed, with a kind of practical tenderness, to take things slowly. There were boundaries to respect. She wanted time to process what it meant to accept affection. He wanted to make sure his presence didn't feel like an obligation. They set small rules: no grand gestures without conversation, no sudden assumptions about their relationship, no misusing his position for advantage. The list of kindly reasonable things felt like scaffolding for something fragile. Over the next several weeks, their lives threaded together in gentle arcs rather than sudden bursts of intensity. He visited the bookshop twice a week at times she could predict. They read together on slow Sunday afternoons and traded small confidences like bookmarks. He listened when she spoke about her fears, about not being enough, about sliding back into solitude, and he offered steady reassurance in small deeds, dropping off a box of high-quality tea bags when he knew they were low, leaving a note with the receipt for a stack of books he bought and donated in the shop's name rather than his. His gestures were practical and unshowy, calibrated to make her feel neither indebted nor diminished. Sophie watched him at community events, quietly engaging with volunteers, deflecting praise towards staff, listening more than talking, and she found herself admiring the way he used influence without showiness. He could have been grand. Instead, he built comforts that felt like permission.
She also noticed the ways he still flinched when certain topics came up, how quickly he would fold conversation into safer topics if something edged too close to vulnerability. The wounds, she realized, were not healed, they were simply bared differently. There were nights, too, when fear returned like a low tide. Sophie would wake at odd hours and imagine conversations reframed by money or status, images of chandeliers and private jets that had nothing to do with the man who left a handwritten note behind the register. She would ask herself whether she was enough for someone who moved in different rooms. He would sometimes see the worry in her face and take her hand in public like a soft punctuation, not possessive but committed. "You are enough," he'd say, not as a cure-all but as a steady fact. One evening, when autumn had started to bruise the leaves with gold, they sat in the same cafe where they'd first spoken, the kettle hissing its old human song. Rain stitched the window pane, and the place hummed with the small warmth of other people's lives. Sophie sipped tea and watched a child hide behind a newspaper, the ordinary joy of the scene easing something in her chest. Daniel stirred his cup, pushing aside a swirl of steam. "There are days I fear I'll be judged," he confessed, then met her with a glance that asked for understanding rather than forgiveness. "Not because of what I have, but because of what I've lost. I worry I'll bring the past into the present and make you pay for mistakes you didn't commit." She smiled, half mocking, half soft. "If you brought everything you'd lost, we'd make a shelf for it. We could dust it off together." He laughed, and the sound had a freer edge than she had heard before. "I don't want you to feel like a charity case," he said. "I want this because I want you, not because I think you're in need of rescue." "I don't want to be fixed," she replied. "I want to be chosen." "And you are," he said without hesitation. The conviction in his voice shook something loose inside her. He didn't say grand things. He just reiterated, in practical, plain language, the choice he'd already been making by turning up in her life with gentleness. As the weeks moved, they navigated awkward dinners, conversations about money and values, and slow admissions of where each still kept scars. They argued once over something small and absurd about weekend plans, and discovered that they could disagree and still return to each other. The research in between, the small acts of attention, became the scaffolding of trust. The night Sophie realized how deep her feelings had become was unremarkable in its details. Rain, the soft lamplight of the shop as she closed up, the lingering smell of lemon cleaner and old paper. They had spent the evening arranging a display for an upcoming local author event, their hands occasionally brushing across a stack of newly arrived books. Daniel had helped, not out of obligation, but with a genuine interest that warmed her. When the bell jangled as he stood to leave, he paused in the doorway and looked back. There was an openness in his face that made the air between them clear and charged. "Will you come to the launch?" he asked. "It would mean a lot." She thought of the promise she had kept for so long, of the fortress she had constructed, and then she thought of the streetlights, of his hand in hers sometimes, of the way he'd looked at her when she admitted fear. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there."
He crossed the room and stood very close, close enough that she could see the fleck of gray near his temple. He didn't reach for her in a way that belonged to lovers or to the intensity of the beginning. Instead, he simply remained present. "There's something I want to say," he began, and then paused, searching for a phrasing that wasn't theatrical. "I was certain I couldn't do this. Love, that is. I thought my heart had reasons not to open. But being with you has made me want to be brave in ways I should have been before." Sophie felt tears rise, luminous and sudden. She had made